Oldies, Oldies. Oldies is a term for musical genres such as pop music, rock and roll, doo-wop, surf music, broadly characterized as classic rock and pop rock from the second half of the 20th century, specifically from around the mid-1950s to the 1980s, as well as for a radio format playing this music. After 2000, 1970s music was increasingly included. Classic Hits has been seen as a successor to the oldies format on the radio, with music from the 1980s serving as the core format. Description: this broad category includes styles as diverse as doo-wop, early rock and roll, novelty songs, bubblegum music, folk rock, psychedelic rock, baroque pop, surf music, soul music, rhythm and blues, classic rock, some blues, and some country music. Golden oldies usually refers to music exclusively from the 1950s and 1960s. Oldies radio typically features artists such as Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, the Beatles, Jerry Lee Lewis, the Beach Boys, Frankie Avalon, the Four Seasons, Paul Anka, Neil Sedaka, Little Richard, and Sam Cooke, as well as such musical movements and genres as early rock and roll, rockabilly, doo-wop, soul music, Motown. One notable omission from most oldies playlists is the music of the folk revival of the early 1960s. Most traditional oldies stations limit their on-air playlists to no more than 300 songs, based on the programming strategy that average listeners and passive listeners will stay tuned provided they are familiar with the hits being played. A drawback to this concept is the constant heavy rotation and repetition of the station's program library, as well as rejection of the format by active listeners. This can be avoided either through the use of a broader playlist or by rotating different songs from the oldies era into and out of the playlist every few weeks. The oldies format has an inherent advantage over current music formats in that it can draw popular songs from a broad period of over a decade and is not bound to devote the majority of its airtime to a single top 40. Oldies has some overlap with the classic hits and classic rock formats. Classic hits features pop and rock hits from the mid-1970s to early 1990s, while classic rock focuses on album rock from the late 1960s to 1990s, sometimes playing newer material made in the same style as the older songs. As formats have drifted in time with their target audiences, classic hits and classic rock have moved further away from pure oldies, which has largely remained a static format. The term oldies in the early days of the rock era and before referred to the traditional pop music songs of previous decades. A 1953 record review in Billboard describes 1925's Yes Sir, That's My Baby as an oldie. Oldies is known for the near total and sometimes arbitrary exclusion of some acts that were very popular in their time, including the classic hits format. A variation on the oldies theme is classic hits, which provides most of the playlist of oldies with some classic rock, with an addition of contemporaneous R&B and pop hits as well, striking a balance between the mostly 1970s-focused classic rock genre and the more broad-based oldies format. The evolution of oldies into classic hits is an example of channel drift. Oldies radio history: 1970s, 1980s and 1990s. Decline of oldies formats. Beginning in the year 2000, oldies stations began to notice that their demographics were getting older and harder to sell. Still, at that time only a few stations dumped the format altogether. A few, such as Orlando's Wackle, went for a flavor of the month format called Jammin' Oldies. But most continued to hang onto the format initially. Since around 2000, stations have begun to limit selections from the 1950s and early 1960s. At the same time, these stations began playing songs from as late as 1979 and even a few 1980s songs. WCBS FM New York, slightly cut back on the previous 1,964 oldies and slightly increased the 1970s and 1980s songs early in 2001. They also eliminated the overnight currents and recents at the same time, along with some specialty shows. In 2002, many oldies stations began dropping previous 1964 music from their playlists, since the earlier music tended to appeal. WCBS-FM canceled their doo-wop shock program and began playing only one previous 1964 oldie per hour. By 2003, there were fewer than 50 songs from the 1950s and early 1960s in the regular rotation. Many stations have since dropped the oldies format because of low ad revenue despite high ratings. On June 3, 2005, New York's WCBS-FM, an oldies-based station for over 3 decades, abruptly switched to the Jack FM format, resulting in a tremendous outcry from oldies fans in the Big Apple, and a huge decline in revenue followed. WJMK in Chicago WCBS-FM sister station switched to Jack FM on the same day. Some point to the demise of WCBS-FM and WJMK as a sign that the oldies format is in danger, for many of the same reasons that the adult standards and smooth jazz formats are disappearing. The oldies format returned to WCBS-FM on July 12, 2007, in an updated form featuring music from 1964 to 1989, and without the word oldies, but rather greatest hits in the on-air positioning, with songs such as Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper, Gloria by Laura Branigan. By the mid-2010s, as the phrase classic hits came to entail a format centered around late 1970s disco era and 1980s pop, dance, and rock format, the phrase oldies had come to entail a 1960s to mid-1970s format that centered mostly on soft rock and easy listening, akin to the old, more upbeat 1960s and 1970s stations are known within the industry as gold classic hits. 1960s music is, as of 2020, becoming increasingly rare on radio. Of the 1,000 most played songs on radio as of May 2020, only 4 of them are from before 1970, and 3 of them also benefit from being aired on classic rock stations as well as oldies and classic hits. The decline has been most dramatic among instrumental selections. This is despite a small pantheon of songs from that era that have become part of an eternal jukebox of all ages event records, as well as parents and grandparents who had listened to the music when they were younger passing those songs on to their children. In the latter case, the older songs popular among the younger crowd can be more random, driven by exposure in television. Other oldies radio stations. The oldies format remains one of the most popular formats on radio in markets where it is still active. Some of the most successful major market oldies stations today really lean towards the classic hits format and include KRTHK Earth 101 in Los Angeles, XHPRS FM 105.7, The Walrus in Tijuana, San Diego, Cola 99.9 in Riverside, San Bernardino, Kino in Fresno, Cal. WLS-FM in Chicago, however, is similar to the way oldies stations sounded several years back. They still play 1 or 2 previous 1,964 songs an hour during the day and as many as 4 an hour at night. However, to illustrate the continued decline in the format, San Francisco's KFRC moved toward classic hits in 2005 and dropped this format entirely in 2006 in favor of the rhythmic AC Imovi format, which left most of Northern California without. However, KFRC had already evolved its format and positioning to classic hits at the time it changed to Move In. But KFRC was not gone for long. On May 17, 2007, with free FM Hot Talk format failing on 106.9 KFR, CBS relaunched KFRC with a rock-leaning classic hits format on 106.9. But KFRC was not back for long either. On October 27, 2008, 106.9 KFRC FM became an all-news 740 KCBS AM simulcast. KFRC now only airs on 106.9 FM HD-2 and online at KFRC.com. But KFRC came back again. On January 1, 2009, KFRC returned on the radio at 1550 AM as True Oldies. KZQZ, which airs in St. Louis, Missouri and began playing oldies in March 2008, has held on to the traditional oldies format, playing a wide variety of top 40 Billboard hits from the 1950s, 1960s, and early 1970s. Non-commercial WXRB 95.1 FM in Dudley, Massachusetts, one of the first non-commercial all-oldies stations in North America, began playing golden oldies on March 6, 2005, at 1:00 p.m., focusing on the years 1954 through 1979. On August 27, 2009, Grand Rapids, Michigan station WGVU became the first public radio station to feature an all-oldies format. The format has since been imitated by other public radio stations. For example, WCNY-FM in Syracuse, New York has begun broadcasting a personality-based oldies format on its HD Radio digital subchannel. Jones Radio Networks, Wait Radio Networks, and Transtar Radio Networks also offer 24-hour satellite-distributed oldies formats. Since those companies have integrated into the Dial Global Corporation, the networks have merged into one Cool Gold. Satellite Music Network offered Oldies Radio. Oldies Radio survived until its acquisition by ABC, but has since rebranded as Classic Hits Radio under current owner Cumulus Media Networks, focusing on music primarily from the 1970s and 1980s, with some limited 1960s music. ABC also offered the True Oldies channel, a 24-hour oldies network programmed and voice-tracked at all hours by Scott Shannon, at the time morning show host at ABC WPLJ. The True Oldies channel was conceived on the concept of avoiding the drift into 1970s and 1980s music that the oldies format was undergoing in the first years of the 21st century. Eventually, by the end of the network's terrestrial run in 2014, it had taken a hybrid approach, with both 1960s and 1970s music being featured at the core of the network, with some limited 1980s music included. In North America, satellite radio broadcasters XM and Sirius launched in 2001 and 2002, respectively, with more than a dozen oldies radio channels, with XM offering separate stations for each decade from the 1940s to the 1990s, and Sirius doing the same for the 1950s through the 1980s. These companies also offered specific genre channels for disco and dance hits, garage rock, classic country, and vintage R&B and soul hits. These pay radio channels boasted thousands of songs in their libraries, ensuring far less repetition than traditional broadcast stations. In November 2008, following a merger of Sirius and XM, the two services shifted to a unified group of decades channels, with the playlists for most cut back to reflect a more conventional style of oldies programming. Music Choice similarly offers an interruption-free oldies station which covers the 1950s and 1960s, primarily from the rock and roll era, as well as decades channels for the 1970s through the 1990s. A number of internet radio stations also carry the format. References